Hey there, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. So for today's video, I kind of want to talk about a criticism that I saw going around specifically against me and my recent video on Barbie specifically that I actually think is really worthwhile, and I think getting to a blind spot that I have that I want to kind of discuss openly and talk about my blind spot and how I can do better to address it, as well as my kind of feelings about the criticism itself. Before I get started on this, I just want to say that this is something that I am ruminating on, and part of the reason that I'm addressing it in this way is because I actually do want to hear folks' thoughts on this. Because quite often, the way that these things are handled is like a criticism is put up, and then I either have to ignore it or I have to respond to it, and then the way it gets responded to is often in like replies on like Tumblr or Twitter or whatever, and it just ends up kind of creating like an adversarial conversation where more I want to have an open conversation. So hopefully this can engender that, but I do want to like accept the criticism and take responsibility for it, but also kind of present my point of view as well. So I just want to read out the criticism. Unfortunately, the person who posted the criticism on Tumblr, I can't say their name in a YouTube video. Not that I have a problem with it, but it is sort of playing on some terminology that YouTube would target me for. So I'll just censor their name, unfortunately, but please go seek them out. I think this person has good things to say. I kind of just stopped watching videos by trans essayists. Nothing against them personally, but there's just so much casual trans androphobia that gets slipped in, probably without their knowledge, but it's hard to watch. Jessie Gender from her Barbie video, she says something that basically implies that somehow trans men are like the common transgender. That he gets praised and benefited from his masculinity in a way that trans women do not benefit from their femininity. I just wish trans people would stop making sweeping generalizations about all other trans people solely based out of their own experiences. The video was about white feminism and the lack of Barbie's intersectionality, but then just ignore the intersectionality of trans men. For anyone wondering, the part with the trans androphobia is around the 1:39 an hour and 39 minutes in mark. And I'm going to just play the clip for you. Trans people generally, and trans women and non-binary folks especially, have a long history of being attacked because we directly point out how the binary dichotomy that we exist within is not only bullshit, but the desire to exist within a power hierarchy based on that dichotomy is not the end goal for any of us. We rupture that concept because non-binary people, trans men and trans women, specifically choose to work against or ignore the incentive for power through gendered means. But by doing so, we often get attacked even by those who are supposed to be supportive of us because we are attacking the status quo that lets them live in luxury. This is, how can I put this, not cool. I take issue with her implication that trans men have the desire to exist within a power hierarchy and that they are less attacked. Do you see what I mean? It's these little statements, casual. In the next part, a few seconds later, she adds trans men back, saying that trans women, non-binaries, and trans men fight against the system or whatever, but why are they excluded from the first part? So being honest, I kind of have mixed feelings about this criticism, but it does get to the heart of something that I think I can be better about addressing. Being honest, my initial feelings upon seeing this criticism was I kind of balked at it because my thinking is that my statement does include trans men. In fact, I remember when I was writing the script for Barbie and I was writing that line, I specifically said trans people generally because I wanted to make sure that I included trans men. I specifically worded it that way to include trans men because trans men, by relation to being trans, break the rigid gender structures of our society, quite literally also breaking binary gender assumptions that our society has, and by doing so, push back against the binary, as I say in that video. And the reason that I put the emphasis in that sentence upon trans women and non-binary folks is because non-binary people, in my mind, quite literally do not fit into the cis-normative world's attempts to define people in binary structures. Non-binary people can be femme or masc or anything under the sun that doesn't even align with how we think about binary within Western cultural conceptualizations. I mean, I myself am a femme non-binary person. I do present more femme, I've gotten, like surgeries and I take estrogen to present myself in a more femme way, but I do sort of slot myself into thinking about myself as non-binary. And there are masked non-binary people as well who do something similar. But then there are non-binary people who don't conform to any of that bullshit that we think about in our society or don't conceptualize themselves in any way like that, even if other people outside would try to fit them into a mask or femme box. And as a result of all of that, and just being able to think about their gender, our gender, in that way, kind of ruptures that binary structure just by the very overt nature of being non-binary. Like, being non-binary quite literally breaks binary structures of our gendered assumptions. And then I go in and put more emphasis on trans women as well, because trans women and often non-binary people, because again, non-binary people who present in femme ways are often slotted into the trans women role, even though they don't necessarily think of ourselves that way. Trans women are seen as lowering themselves on the power hierarchy. Like, the whole video Barbie is talking about how our society itself creates, power hierarchies based on these binary dichotomies that it sets up, white versus black, man versus woman, that sort of thing. And women are seen as the lesser power dynamic. And then in order to attempt to justify that power dynamic that was created by the societal structures that were put in place by those in power, they then say that it's somehow natural and normal. Like, women are weaker than men, or, black people are more animalistic, or whatever bullshit, racist, homophobic, sexist nonsense that they come up with, using pseudoscience or whatever phrenology nonsense that they wish to use. And the way that that's often wielded against trans people is saying that we have some, biological essentialization features about us. That, trans men are always going to be women, trans women are always going to be men, and you can always see or tell or whatever, without understanding that, our biology is also varied across a spectrum, as well as, biological features and sex characteristics or whatever are mutable, and also don't define how we think about gender in terms of how we can enact it within our society, because gender, as Judith Butler talks about, is performative, and we make gender real by our performance of it and how we think about gender in terms of how we enact it into our society overall, as those in power try to make it appear in order to justify their power hierarchies as somehow some natural way the world works. And whether or not you want to fight back for women empowerment, it still often is the society itself is trying to slot you into these dichotomies in order to remove intersectionality of that discussion. Hence why we get things like white feminism, where white feminists will talk about empowering women, but will then go and try to push down black women in order to raise up themselves, because they don't see the intersectionality of that fight and how those power dynamics all stem from the same structures that keep everyone down. And that's kind of what the Barbie video is about. And so trans women, by putting ourselves in what the world would see as a lesser part of the power hierarchy, quite literally break this concept of the narrative of our society that people constantly want to get power over people, which is often quite why that thinking will lead people like TERFs to say things like, oh, you're appropriating womanhood, because they still frame themselves in that thinking about a power hierarchy. And so for what they see as men to come into their space and claim their victimhood or whatever nonsense, it kind of goes back to that same power hierarchy dynamic and framing. It's also why they will frame trans women as men to create, again, that power hierarchy and to otherize trans women from a women's space. Because, again, it's just sort of slotting into that us versus them mindset that these dichotomies try to engender. All that goes to say, and getting back to the criticism, is that there is a reason I put the especially emphasis on trans women and non-binary folks in that sentence, but at least in terms of how I was thinking about it when I wrote that sentence, I did mean to include trans men in that sentence, because I said trans people generally, and that includes trans men. That was my first feeling in response to this criticism. I did include trans men, and there's a specific reason why I put an emphasis on trans women and non-binary folks. And then I also talk about trans men as this person who's criticizing the video says a few moments later. But I just don't specifically call out and put emphasis on trans men in this moment. That all being said, though, if I take a further step back and stop coming from a place of defensiveness, I do see their point, because there is sort of an implicit assumption that I made of why don't I need to call out trans men in that sentence? Why can't I just slot them into trans people generally? Why can't I just say trans men, trans women, non-binary folks, break the binary assumption, and then go further into that stuff? And I kind of figured that some of that would be implicit given the entire context of the video, but it's not stated. And the assumption by me that I didn't need to make it explicit kind of goes to that, blind spot of mine. And as they say, transandronophobia, in the sense that I didn't think it necessary to. And that goes to these implicit biases that I have as a femme-presenting trans woman. And going even further to just talk specifically about the Barbie movie, this is something that, I could have done a better job getting further into. Like, there's a lot of things I cover in the Barbie video. I talk about the racial dynamics of the film. I even talk to Foreign Man in a Foreign Land and Princess Weeks in the video, and supposed to talk to them about the racial dynamics of the movie, because that was something that I didn't feel I could speak to from, authentic place, because I am not black. So I included them in the video to include perspective. And then I spoke from a non-binary and trans women perspective as well. But why did I not wish to include, trans men, like get a trans man? I have to have that conversation within the video. And part of it, to be fair, was like the video is really long. The impetus for me was to talk about like my perspective as a trans woman, but then also talk about these racial dynamics that I saw throughout the film that I wanted to give voice to. And that was like sort of like the reason that I wanted to go into the video. But there is something to be said that like I didn't have the impetus to talk about trans men within the video. And when there's a moment where I do talk about trans men, there's an implicit blind spot on my part to not feel the need to explicitly call that out and say it specifically. That like I didn't feel I could speak for trans men, or the moments where I can talk about trans men, I sort of slot them into a more generalized statement instead of explicitly calling trans men out. Like that does speak to my blind spot. And I guess the answer is like I either should have included trans men more in the video, or I should have been clearer about like where the place that I had to stop from where I was coming from my perspective was. And not to play defense of myself, but it's something that I'm trying to get better about. I mean, I hope I've shown throughout my videos that I've been trying to bring in more voices from other communities to have a say in the sort of more broader generalizations that I'm talking about in my videos. Because what I'm finding is that I feel a need to talk more about intersectionalities around issues rather than just talking about issues from my perspective alone, because there are already so many wonderful, great video essayists, especially coming from trans women perspectives. And not to say that I can't have something valuable to say from that perspective, I feel like I often do. But that I do feel that there is a missing piece in our space about talking about the intersectionalities of that. And I feel that often, a blind spot for me is not always including trans men in that conversation. I do have many wonderful trans men creators and friends who do great work that I can put in videos more. And that being said, I do try to include folks like the wonderful Swolesome, who is a fantastic trans man creator. I've had him in a few of my videos. He is often a script reader for a bunch of my videos. And that's not to say like, look, I have a trans man reading my work, so it's totally okay. It's more to say, no, the opportunities are available to me to be able to be more inclusive of folks, especially trans men. And, sometimes I take that opportunity, but not all the time. And the times that I don't, which is fine, which I do think is fine to a degree, depending on how you write the thing, but it is notable when I am not doing that and then don't take the time to make that clear when there's a moment that a intersection with trans men could come up. And that is something that I need to be way more cognizant of. I fully and completely agree. And also, on this note, by the way, I should also call out Swolesome's really great video, I Screwed Up on the Internet, where he talks about not only like taking ownership for making a mistake in your work, but also talks about actually something very similar to this discussion of like trans men and how we talk about trans men within videos on YouTube and video essayist spheres. So please go check out that video because it is really, really wonderful. And moving on from that, and to take responsibility and ownership of that too, is, there were some people in the comments of the video that saw this criticism and then came to the video to then comment on the video that said stuff like, oh, you don't see trans men as like real trans people. And I'm not going to even like defend myself on that, because the end point of the day is, while my intention was not that, to make someone feel that I didn't include trans men as trans people, the effect was that I made some trans people feel that I didn't see them as full trans people by my exclusion or not directly calling them out. And that sucks. That's on me. I take ownership of that, and I apologize, earnestly and honestly. And that all being said, it really is important to talk about how trans men do get wrapped up into these discussions of power hierarchies, because quite often trans men are suffer often in silence or in less visible ways, because our society tends to focus on the more sensationalized ways trans women are attacked. Trans women are very much under attack in a lot of ways by TERFs, by a lot of laws that also include trans men and non-binary people. But like a lot of the media focuses on trans women and the hyperfixation and fetishization in both sexual and newsworthy ways of trans women does leave a lot of trans men not discussed. And trans men are quite often infantilized, made to be seen as like having no power in a situation, are quite often infantilized, talked down to by not only transphobes, but also trans people. And there's also a lot of attempts by like TERFs and transphobes to like claim trans men. I mean, look at the way that Elliot Page was treated. You saw so many like turfy lesbians saying, "Oh, we lost one," when Elliot Page came out as a trans man. And you see that like across the board with trans men. It's like, "Oh, you're not really. Oh, you're just," like even J.K. Rowling in her essay, her very transphobic essay. So it's like, "Oh, I see these trans men who are lost and confused and just they just want to escape womanhood," without like actually recognizing like, no, trans men are men. They're not trying to escape womanhood. They're being themselves. And this sort of like denial of their identity, this infantilization of them, can often lead to not only mental health harm, but like lack of access to medical care. And this happens not only within, like transphobe spaces, but within trans spaces and queer spaces as well. It happens continually, just as there is generalized transphobia you can find within queer spaces. You can find transandrophobia towards trans men within queer spaces and even trans spaces as well. And all of that goes to things like transphobia and misogyny. And that's not to say that trans men are women, but the place that these sort of infantilizations come from, or the diminishing of trans men's identities, comes out of misogyny. The person who is enacting those bigotries views trans men as women and is thereby viewing their identity as somehow less than or not real, or questioning them and their validity as men, as well as transphobia generally that we have in our society, coming out of, the creation of gender dichotomies that come from this sort of misogyny and trying to place women as secondary, that itself is born out of things like colonialization and racism, because everything connects, as I talk about in the Barbie video. And that ties into this whole discussion of how our society places people into these dichotomies and power hierarchies and things like that, that I could have discussed further in the Barbie video. And so that is something that I could have better focused on. Because when I do things like place the emphasis on non-binary people and trans women, while I do have my reasons for having done so and not explicitly calling out trans men as well, it does play into that very power dynamic that I was talking about, right? And that by no means was my intention, and I was trying to draw attention to the more explicit ways that non-binary and trans women break these power dichotomies. It does leave that implication that trans men's issues are less important, or that somehow trans men don't want to conform to binary dichotomies, which is not what I was saying, and I don't think the sentence says that, but the exclusion leaves that implication open to interpretation, because it is not explicitly stated. And that is a lack of specificity on my part that comes out of my blind spots, that then plays into, in that lack of specificity, the very power dichotomies that I'm attempting to lay bare. So by attempting to actually make explicit how we talk about power dichotomies, I also implicitly play into them by the impreciseness of my language in that moment. That being said, what I do want to say, what I want to promise, is that while I did make this mistake in the Barbie video, I do have a video that I am currently working on. It's literally already been shot, it's being edited, and hopefully will come out within the next month, but it's a very big video that's going to go into a lot of different stuff, but one which predominantly focuses on a trans man's narrative and how we treat trans men. And I tried to get a bunch of folks generally, but several trans men, to have voices both within the video and help in terms of the writing and production of that video. So there is stuff that I am working on that is going to present that perspective and try to bring attention to it with my platform. All that goes to say is I don't want to come across as like promoting my upcoming video. The point that I want to say is it's not something that I've not thought about, if that's a way to phrase it. But it is something that I have not completely addressed all of my biases in that regard. And so it's something that I too need to be more self-aware of and work through, because, and this is not to like overgeneralize it, but we all have biases. Every creator does. And I think it's necessary for creators to find out where those blind spots are and try to confront them and work with them and wrestle with them and try to do better about them. Like, no creator is not going to have those blind spots. But this one specifically is one that is very common among trans women and non-binary femme-presenting creators, of which there is, to be frank, an overabundance of, maybe not overabundance of, but like there's a disproportionate amount of trans women and non-binary femme creators in the like Venn diagram of trans creators on YouTube. And so for there to continually be that blind spot with the more visible aspect of video essayists and trans video essayists, then it's something that needs to be addressed. And I'm going to try and work on it. And to be fair, it's something I've been aware of and tried to do better about, but not always. And that's on me. So I hope this discussion comes across as like not me trying to be defensive and trying to take accountability for the criticism, but also at least trying to present where I'm coming from about it in a way that's not trying to deny accountability. And if it does, like, please let me know, because again, that is part of how I want to improve. So yeah, I toss it to all of you. What do you think about this generally, about me specifically in terms of this criticism? And again, just to put a fine point on it, to any trans man who I made feel like I didn't hear you, see you, or include you in my thinking of the trans community, I am deeply, deeply sorry for that. And I take complete ownership for having caused you that feeling. So yeah, I think that's probably the best place to end. So live long and prosper, everyone.